Everyone stared when the homeless woman in torn clothes approached the elderly couple's table at the upscale diner, her hands trembling as she offered them her steaming bowl of soup. The other diners whispered, assuming she was begging for money. They had no idea she was giving away her last meal in 3 days, or that the grateful couple were the parents of Boston's most powerful billionaire. What happened next was so shocking, it made headlines. Welcome back to Eva's Stories. I have missed you all so much. Thank you for sticking around with me. I truly appreciate your love and support. If you are enjoying this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, like the video, and comment where you are watching from. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories. And trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's continue. The alarm screamed at 4:47 a.m. in the penthouse overlooking Boston Harbor, but Harrison Sterling was already awake, standing at the windows that stretched from floor to ceiling, watching the city breathe in the pre-dawn darkness. His reflection stared back, 35 years old, steel-gray eyes, dark hair perfectly styled even at this ungodly hour. The Armani pajamas cost more than most people made in a month, a fact that used to amuse him. Now it felt like wearing a straitjacket made of silk. Another nightmare? Catherine Wells materialized beside him, her heels clicking against the marble floor even at this hour. His assistant never seemed to sleep, a quality that had made her indispensable and, lately, insufferable. Numbers don't sleep. Harrison turned away from the window, straightening his shoulders. The Jakarta deal closes at market open. The Sao Paulo acquisition needs review. The foundation board meets at 10. Catherine's fingers flew across her tablet. Your parents called again. 7th time this week. Something twisted in Harrison's chest, sharp and familiar. Schedule lunch. Next month. They asked about Christmas. I don't do Christmas. Sir, it's been 3 years since. Catherine. His voice carried the weight of a man who'd fired CEOs before breakfast. Drop it. She nodded, but her eyes held that look, the one that said she remembered when he was human. Back when Eleanor and Frank Sterling's son still answered their calls, still showed up for Sunday dinners, still believed money couldn't buy everything that mattered. The elevator chimed. Harrison's jaw tightened. Only one person had access to the penthouse elevator at this hour. Frank Sterling stepped out, 70 years old and still broad-shouldered, still carrying himself like the construction foreman he'd been before Harrison's tech empire made him wealthy beyond imagination. Eleanor followed, her silver hair perfectly coiffed despite the early hour, her green eyes, the same shade as Harrison's, bright with determination. We need to talk, Frank said without preamble. You need an appointment. Harrison moved toward his home office, but Eleanor's voice stopped him cold. Your father's dying. The words hung in the air like smoke. Harrison turned slowly, his face a mask of control. Excuse me. Eleanor's chin lifted, that stubborn tilt he'd inherited. Pancreatic cancer. Stage 3. 6 months. Maybe 8 if we're lucky. The room tilted. Harrison gripped the back of a chair, his knuckles white. When? 3 weeks ago, Frank said quietly. We wanted to tell you properly. In person. 3 weeks. The words came out like broken glass. You've known for 3 weeks and you're telling me now? We tried, Eleanor's voice cracked. You wouldn't see us. Wouldn't take our calls. Catherine made excuses. Harrison's eyes cut to his assistant, who had the grace to look ashamed. You knew. They asked me not to say anything. They wanted. Get out. His voice was deadly quiet. Both of you. Now. Catherine gathered her things and fled. Eleanor started to follow, but Frank caught her arm. We're not leaving, the older man said. Not this time. I have a board meeting in 6 hours. 3 acquisitions to close. A foundation to run. You have a father who's dying, Eleanor snapped. A father who built houses with his bare hands so you could build an empire. A father who's proud of you even though you've forgotten where you came from. The accusation hit like a physical blow. Harrison sank into the chair, suddenly feeling every one of his 35 years. What do you want from me? Frank and Eleanor exchanged a look, the kind that came from 47 years of marriage, the kind Harrison had stopped believing in. We want our son back, Eleanor whispered. Even if it's just for a little while. Delilah Monroe jolted awake to the sound of footsteps on the frozen concrete above. Her breath formed clouds in the December air as she pressed herself deeper into the shadows beneath the bridge, clutching the thin blanket she'd found in a dumpster 3 days ago. 28 years old, with skin the color of rich earth and eyes that had seen too much, she moved with the careful grace of someone who'd learned that survival meant being invisible. The footsteps passed. Delilah exhaled slowly, her ribs aching from the cold that had settled deep in her bones. 3 months on the streets had taught her the rhythm of the city, when to hide, when to move, when to hope for kindness from strangers who mostly looked through her like she was already a ghost. Her stomach cramped with hunger. She'd eaten yesterday, half a sandwich from the shelter on Beacon Hill before they ran out of food. The day before that, nothing. The day before that, an apple someone dropped near the public garden that she'd picked up and eaten despite the bruises. This wasn't how the story was supposed to go. 6 months ago, Delilah had been a social worker at Boston Children's Services, helping kids navigate the system she'd once been trapped in herself. She'd had an apartment in Somerville, nothing fancy but clean and safe. She'd had friends, a routine, a purpose. She'd had hope. Then the budget cuts came. Last hired, first fired, they'd said, as if those 4 words could erase 3 years of 12-hour days and kids who trusted her with their secrets. As if they could explain how rent didn't pause for unemployment, how medical bills from her father's cancer treatment didn't disappear just because her paycheck did. Her father. The thought of him always came with a stab of guilt so sharp it took her breath away. Jerome Monroe, who'd worked double shifts at the post office to put her through college. Who'd been so proud when she got her social work degree, so sure she was going to change the world. He died while she was living in her car, too proud to tell him she'd lost everything, too afraid to see the disappointment in his eyes. By the time she'd swallowed her pride and tried to go home for the funeral, the house was gone. Foreclosed. Her stepmother had moved to Florida with her sister, leaving no forwarding address and taking whatever might have helped Delilah start over. Now she lived in the spaces between, under bridges, in doorways, in the shadows of a city that had no room for people who fell through the cracks. Delilah pushed herself to her feet, her joints protesting the cold. Her reflection in a puddle showed what 3 months of homelessness had done. Hollow cheeks, tangled black hair she'd tried to keep clean in public restrooms, clothes that had once been professional but now hung loose on her diminished frame. But her eyes were still fierce. Still alive. She had $12.37 in the pocket of her coat. Money she'd earned helping an old man carry groceries 3 blocks in exchange for a $5 bill and the loose change from his car's cup holder. Enough for coffee and maybe something small at the diner on Cambridge Street, the one where the waitress sometimes pretended not to notice when Delilah sat nursing a single cup for hours, trying to stay warm. The diner. Betty's place. It had become her sanctuary, the one spot in the city where she could sit at a table like a human being instead of a problem to be solved or ignored. Delilah gathered her few possessions, the blanket, a backpack with holes that held everything she owned, a water bottle she refilled at public fountains. She'd learned to travel light, to move fast when necessary, to disappear when the police came through with their warnings about loitering. But first, she'd allow herself one small luxury. One hot meal at Betty's diner, where the coffee was strong and the owner sometimes slipped an extra roll onto her plate when he thought she wasn't looking. As she climbed up from beneath the bridge, the sunrise painted Boston Harbor in shades of gold and pink. For a moment, just one moment, Delilah let herself remember what it felt like to see beauty instead of just survival. To hope instead of just endure. She didn't know that 12 blocks away, Harrison Sterling was learning that money couldn't buy back time with a dying father. She didn't know that in 18 hours, their worlds would collide in a way that would change everything. She only knew that she was hungry, and she had $12.37, and sometimes that had to be enough. The diner on Cambridge Street was already glowing with warm light when Delilah pushed through the glass door, the bell above jingling her arrival. Betty Sullivan looked up from behind the counter, her weathered face creasing into a smile that had been Delilah's lifeline for weeks. "Morning, honey," Betty called out, already reaching for the coffee pot. "Usual spot?" Delilah nodded, sliding into the booth by the window where she could watch the street and feel less trapped. The vinyl seat was cracked but clean, and someone had left a newspaper on the table. Yesterday's business section with headlines about Sterling Enterprises' latest acquisition. She didn't need to see Harrison Sterling's photograph to know what men like him looked like. She'd grown up in their shadow, had spent years watching them reshape the city while people like her father worked themselves to death in their service. But today wasn't about bitter thoughts. Today was about the warmth seeping back into her fingers and the promise of food that would quiet the grinding emptiness in her stomach. Betty appeared with coffee, black and strong. "You eating today?" Delilah counted her money one more time, the bills soft from handling. "What can I get for $10? "Plenty," Betty lied kindly. "Tommy's got fresh eggs. Made biscuits this morning. How about eggs over easy, 2 biscuits, and some of those breakfast potatoes you like?" It was more than $10 worth. They both knew it. But Betty had lost a daughter once. Overdose, 5 years ago, and sometimes she looked at Delilah like she was trying to save a ghost. "That sounds perfect," Delilah said softly. As Betty disappeared into the kitchen, Delilah wrapped her hands around the coffee mug and let herself breathe. One hot meal. One moment of normalcy. One small victory against a world that seemed determined to erase her entirely. She had no idea that this simple breakfast would set in motion events that would bring a billionaire to her door, or that the elderly couple about to enter the diner would change the trajectory of her life forever. For now, she was just a hungry woman counting her blessings in quarters and dimes, grateful for coffee that burned away the December cold and a waitress who still saw her as human. The morning sun streamed through the diner windows, and for the first time in months, Delilah Monroe allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. She was wrong about the timeline. They were about to get extraordinary. The dinner rush had died down to a whisper by the time Delilah returned to the diner that evening. She'd spent the day at the Boston Public Library, reading in the warmth until the security guard's pointed looks made it clear her welcome had expired. The December wind cut through her thin coat as she pushed through the glass door, the familiar bell announcing her arrival like an old friend. Betty looked up from wiping down tables, her tired face brightening. "Back again. Twice in one day. Must be my lucky day." Delilah managed a smile, though her stomach had been growling for hours. The breakfast had been her only meal, and the $12 had dwindled to $8 after she'd bought a small coffee at a gas station to justify using their restroom. "Just coffee tonight. And maybe I could sit for a while." "Honey, you sit as long as you need." Betty's voice carried the weight of understanding. She'd been working diners for 30 years, had seen every kind of broken person stumble through those doors. "Tommy's got soup left over. Tomato basil. Made too much, as usual." The lie was gentle, practiced. Delilah's throat tightened with gratitude she couldn't afford to voice. "I couldn't." "You could. And you will." Betty was already ladling soup into a bowl, her movements efficient and final. No arguments. As Delilah settled into her usual booth, the door chimed again. An elderly couple entered, moving slowly against the December cold. The woman leaned heavily on her husband's arm, her silver hair escaping from beneath a wool hat that had seen better years. The man wore a coat that had been expensive once, now faded and carefully mended at the elbows. They chose a table near the window, speaking in whispers that carried the weight of private worry. Delilah couldn't help but notice how the woman's hands shook as she reached for the menu, how the man's eyes swept the prices with a careful calculation of someone counting every penny. "Eleanor, we should just get coffee," the man said quietly, his voice carrying despite his attempt at discretion. "The medical bills this month." The woman, Eleanor, touched his hand. "Frank, we haven't eaten since breakfast. The chemotherapy makes me so weak." Chemotherapy. The word hit Delilah like a physical blow, dragging memories of her father's final months to the surface. The treatments that drained their savings faster than they drained the cancer from his body. The careful arithmetic of survival that reduced every meal to a financial calculation. Betty approached their table with coffee, her professional smile warm but distant. "Evening, folks. What can I get you started with?" Frank cleared his throat. "Just coffee for now. We're taking our time with the menu." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears she tried to hide behind the laminated pages. Delilah watched the woman's shoulders shake with suppressed sobs, watched Frank's weathered hand stroke her arm in helpless comfort. "The treatments are so expensive," Eleanor whispered, not realizing her voice carried in the quiet diner. "I know you're hungry too, but we just can't." Frank's jaw tightened with the particular shame of a man who'd worked his whole life and found it wasn't enough. "We'll figure it out. We always do." But Delilah could see the truth in their faces. They were hungry. Really hungry. The kind of hunger she recognized because it lived in her own bones now, the gnawing emptiness that made it hard to think about anything else. Tommy emerged from the kitchen with her soup, setting it down with his usual gruff kindness. "Eat up before it gets cold." The steam rose from the bowl, rich and inviting. Delilah's mouth watered, her stomach clenching with anticipation. She lifted the spoon, then froze. Eleanor had turned to stare out the window, tears streaming down her cheeks now without pretense. Frank pulled out his wallet, counting bills with the desperate precision of someone hoping mathematics might multiply money through sheer will. Delilah set down her spoon. She thought of her father in his hospital bed, too proud to admit the bills were drowning them. She thought of herself, sitting in waiting rooms while insurance companies found new ways to deny coverage. She thought of all the meals she'd skipped to pay for his medications, and how she'd convinced herself it was worth it because at least they were fighting together. But Frank and Eleanor were fighting alone. Delilah stood up before she could talk herself out of it, the soup cooling behind her as she approached their table. Both looked up in surprise, Frank's expression wary, Eleanor's hopeful in the way of people who'd learned to expect disappointment. "Excuse me," Delilah said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I ordered way too much food. The soup, and I think there's a sandwich coming too. I hate to see it go to waste." Frank's eyes narrowed slightly. "That's very kind, but we're fine." "Frank," Eleanor touched his arm, her voice gentle but firm. "Let the nice lady finish." Delilah smiled, the expression feeling foreign after months of careful neutrality. "My father always said food tastes better when it's shared. Would you mind? I'd feel terrible throwing it away, and I really can't eat all of it." The lie flowed smoothly, practiced from years of social work when she'd learned to help people save face while accepting help. Eleanor's eyes met hers, and in that moment, two women who'd loved dying men recognized each other across the space of shared sorrow. "That's very thoughtful," Eleanor said softly. "If you're sure." "I'm sure." Delilah was already signaling Betty, who approached with the practiced awareness of a woman who'd seen this dance before. "Betty, could you box up my soup for these folks? And maybe throw in a couple of those sandwiches Tommy was making? The turkey ones." Betty's eyes flicked between Delilah and the elderly couple, understanding dawning in her expression. "Of course, honey. Let me get that fixed up for you." As Betty bustled away, Frank studied Delilah with new attention. "You don't look like someone who orders too much food." The observation was gentle but pointed. Delilah met his gaze without flinching. "Sometimes we all need a little kindness from strangers." Eleanor's tears started fresh, but these were different. "Grateful. What's your name?" "Delilah." "I'm Eleanor. This stubborn man is Frank." She squeezed her husband's hand. "We can't thank you enough." "You don't need to thank me." Delilah meant it. The hunger in her stomach felt distant now, replaced by something warmer. "Just take care of each other." Betty returned with 2 containers and a paper bag. "Soup, 2 turkey sandwiches, and I threw in some of those cookies Tommy made this afternoon. Still warm." Frank reached for his wallet, but Delilah was faster, pressing a $20 bill into Betty's hand. It was more than she had, but Betty would understand. Betty always understood. "That's too much," Frank protested, but Delilah was already stepping back. "My father used to say that kindness is the only investment that never loses value," she said. "You two reminded me of that tonight." Before either could protest further, Delilah turned and walked toward the door. Behind her, she heard Eleanor's voice, thick with emotion. "Frank, we have to find out where she lives. We have to repay her somehow." "She's gone," Frank's voice was wondering. "Like an angel." Delilah pushed through the door into the December night, the cold hitting her like a slap. Her stomach cramped with emptiness, and she had $3 left to last until she could figure out her next meal. But her heart felt fuller than it had in months. She didn't know that Frank and Eleanor Sterling would spend the next hour asking Betty questions about the mysterious woman who'd given them her meal. She didn't know that Betty would reluctantly admit she'd seen Delilah sleeping under the Longfellow Bridge, or that the elderly couple would spend the walk home planning how to find her again. She certainly didn't know that Eleanor Sterling would call her son the moment they reached their apartment, her voice shaking with something that wasn't weakness but wonder. "Harrison, I know you're angry with us, but something happened tonight. Something extraordinary." And Harrison Sterling, sitting in his penthouse office at nearly 10 p.m., surrounded by contracts worth millions of dollars, would find himself listening to his mother describe a homeless woman's act of kindness with an attention he hadn't paid to anything in years. "Her name was Delilah," Eleanor would say, her voice carrying across the line with unexpected strength. "And she gave us everything she had." But for now, Delilah simply walked through the Boston streets, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. She headed toward the shelter on Beacon Hill, hoping they still had space, knowing they probably didn't. The December nights were brutal, and beds filled fast. As she walked, she thought about Eleanor's tears and Frank's proud shoulders. She thought about the way they'd looked at each other, the kind of love that survived medical bills and empty stomachs and the grinding worry of growing old in a world that had little patience for either poverty or illness. She thought about her father, and for the first time in months, the memory didn't bring only pain. Tonight, it brought the echo of his voice. Kindness is the only investment that never loses value. Maybe he'd been right after all. The shelter was full, as she'd expected. Delilah nodded to the volunteer who delivered the news with practiced sympathy, then turned back into the night. She'd find somewhere. She always did. Under the bridge again, probably. But tonight, even the prospect of sleeping on cardboard in December couldn't dim the warm glow in her chest. She'd done something good. Something that mattered. She had no way of knowing that 18 hours later, a black Bentley would pull up to her makeshift shelter, carrying a man who'd spent his whole life believing that money was the only currency that mattered. No way of knowing that Eleanor and Frank Sterling had just set in motion events that would change 3 lives forever. For now, she was just a hungry woman walking through the Boston night, carrying nothing but the memory of an elderly couple's gratitude and the unshakable belief that tomorrow might be better than today. The city lights blurred around her as she walked, each step taking her further from the warm diner and deeper into the cold December darkness. But inside her chest, something glowed like embers that refused to die. Kindness, her father had said. The only investment that never loses value. Tonight, Delilah Monroe had made herself rich. Harrison Sterling hadn't slept. He stood at his office windows, watching the harbor emerge from darkness, his mother's words echoing in his mind like a song he couldn't shake. She gave us everything she had. The contracts on his desk remained unsigned. The Jakarta deal, worth $47 million, sat neglected beside cold coffee and the remnants of a dinner he'd barely touched. His phone showed 17 missed calls from Catherine, 12 from board members, and 43 unread emails marked urgent. None of it mattered. His parents had called at 9:47 p.m., their voices animated in a way he hadn't heard since before his father's diagnosis. Eleanor had talked for 37 minutes straight about a homeless woman named Delilah who'd approached their table at some diner on Cambridge Street. She described every detail: the woman's gentle smile, her careful words about having too much food, the way she'd insisted on paying for their meal despite clearly having nothing herself. She was hungry, Harrison, Eleanor had said, her voice breaking. Really hungry. The kind where you can see it in someone's bones. But she gave us her food anyway. Frank had taken the phone then, his construction worker's voice rough with emotion. Your mother cried for an hour after we got home. Good tears, son. The kind that wash away the hurt. Harrison had listened in silence, something cold and uncomfortable shifting in his chest. He'd tried to dismiss it as his parents' sentimentality, their tendency to romanticize random acts of kindness. But the story wouldn't leave him alone. Now, as dawn painted the harbor gold, he found himself staring at his reflection in the window. When was the last time he'd done something that hadn't been calculated for maximum return? When had he last acted on impulse, on pure human feeling rather than strategic advantage? The answer was 3 years ago, before the board had demanded he choose between his heart and his shareholders. Before Amanda had left, taking with her any pretense that his money couldn't buy the things that actually mattered. His phone buzzed. Catherine, again. Sir, the board is asking about the Jakarta contracts. Mr. Yamamoto flew in specifically for your signature. Harrison closed his eyes. $47 million. 6 months of negotiations. His father was dying, and he was thinking about a homeless woman he'd never met instead of the empire that bore his name. Tell them I'm reviewing final details, he said finally. Sir, you've had those contracts for 3 weeks. Catherine. His voice carried warning. Of course, sir. Also, your parents called the office this morning. They want to meet for lunch today. Something twisted in Harrison's stomach. Schedule it for next week. They said it was important. About the woman from last night. The woman. Delilah. Harrison gripped the phone tighter. What about her? They want to find her. Your mother seemed quite insistent that you might be able to help through your foundation's outreach programs. Of course. His parents wanted him to track down their guardian angel so they could repay her kindness. It was exactly the sort of sentimental gesture that had no place in his carefully ordered world. Homeless individuals were statistical problems to be solved through systematic charitable giving, not personal projects that disrupted board meetings. Tell them I'm unavailable, Harrison said, the words tasting like ash. The foundation has protocols. We don't track down individuals for personal favors. Catherine's silence stretched long enough to feel like judgment. I'll relay the message. After she hung up, Harrison stood motionless, staring at his reflection. His father was dying. His parents had found something beautiful in the midst of their nightmare, and he was turning his back on it because it didn't fit into his quarterly projections. But what was the alternative? Drop everything to search Boston streets for a homeless woman his parents had met once? Abandon his responsibilities to chase after some romantic notion of spontaneous kindness? The Jakarta contracts stared at him from his desk. $47 million. 600 jobs. Shareholder value that would cement Sterling Enterprises' position in the Asian market for the next decade. Harrison picked up his pen, then set it down again. His father was dying, and he was thinking about a stranger. Delilah woke to the sound of her own chattering teeth. The December cold had seeped through the cardboard and newspaper she'd gathered for insulation, turning her makeshift bed into a grid of frozen discomfort. Her breath formed clouds in the dim light filtering through broken windows 3 stories above. She'd found the warehouse 2 nights ago, after the shelter had turned her away. It wasn't much, a forgotten corner of Boston's industrial district where developers hadn't yet arrived with their promises of luxury condos and artisanal coffee shops. But it was dry, mostly, and the loading dock provided shelter from the wind that cut across the harbor like a blade. Her stomach cramped with hunger. The memory of giving away her soup felt different in the harsh light of morning, less noble and more foolish. What had possessed her to approach those strangers? To spend money she couldn't afford on people she'd never see again? Delilah sat up slowly, her muscles protesting the cold and the unforgiving concrete beneath her. The elderly couple, Eleanor and Frank, had seemed genuinely grateful, but gratitude didn't change her current reality. She was still homeless, still hungry, still invisible to a city that had no use for people who'd fallen through the cracks. She thought about their conversation, fragments she'd overheard before approaching their table. Medical bills. Chemotherapy. The careful arithmetic of survival that she knew too well. At least they had each other. At least they had a home to return to, even if money was tight. They had insurance, probably, however inadequate. They had family who might help in a crisis. Delilah had nothing but the clothes on her back and $2.73 in her pocket. The rational part of her mind, the part that had kept her alive for 3 months on the streets, whispered that she'd been an idiot. That kindness was a luxury she couldn't afford. That her father's noble sayings about helping others were the philosophy of a man who died broke and forgotten, leaving his daughter to inherit his poverty along with his principles. She stood up, brushing dust and cardboard fragments from her coat. The morning routine was always the same. Check that her few possessions were still secure, find a public restroom to wash her face and hands, figure out where the next meal might come from. Today, that last item felt more pressing than usual. The library would be warm, but they didn't open until 9. The shelter served breakfast at 7, but only to people who'd slept there the night before. There was a church on Boylston Street that sometimes provided coffee and donuts, but that was a 40-minute walk, and Delilah wasn't sure her legs could handle it on an empty stomach. As she gathered her backpack and the blanket that had become her most precious possession, Delilah caught herself thinking about Eleanor's tears. The way the old woman had looked at her with such gratitude, as if a simple gesture had restored her faith in humanity itself. Maybe that was worth being hungry for another day. But as she stepped out of the warehouse into the December morning, the wind cutting through her inadequate coat like a knife, Delilah couldn't shake the feeling that her moment of kindness had been nothing more than expensive sentimentality. The world hadn't changed because she'd given away her soup. Eleanor and Frank would go home to whatever warmth they could afford, and she would remain here, counting coins and calculating how many more nights she could survive before the cold claimed her entirely. Her father had been wrong about kindness being an investment. Some investments were just losses you couldn't afford to take. Delilah pulled her coat tighter and started walking toward the city center, each step carrying her further from the momentary warmth she'd felt the night before. By the time she reached Cambridge Street, where Betty's Diner was already serving breakfast to people who had money to pay for it, she'd convinced herself that helping Eleanor and Frank had been a mistake she wouldn't repeat. She had to focus on survival now, on being practical, on accepting that in a world where $47 million deals were signed before breakfast, one homeless woman's kindness was just a rounding error in someone else's calculations. But as she passed the diner's windows, warm with morning light and the promise of hot coffee, Delilah couldn't quite forget the way Eleanor had smiled at her. The way Frank's weathered hands had trembled as he'd accepted their gift. Maybe her father had been right about one thing. Some investments took longer to pay dividends than others. Harrison arrived at his foundation offices 30 minutes late, a breach of protocol that sent ripples of concern through his staff. The Sterling Foundation occupied 3 floors of a renovated brownstone, its mission statement etched in brass by the entrance: empowering communities through systematic charitable intervention. Systematic. The word had seemed so important when they'd founded the organization 5 years ago, back when Harrison believed that poverty could be solved through proper allocation of resources and data-driven decision-making. Now it felt cold, clinical, divorced from the messy reality of actual human need. Sir. Margaret Walsh, the Foundation's director, appeared at his elbow with the morning briefings. The quarterly allocation meeting starts in 10 minutes. We're reviewing the homeless services budget. Homeless services. Harrison's step slowed. What's our current annual allocation for individual assistance? Margaret consulted her tablet. 2.7 million, distributed through partner organizations. Primarily shelter operations and job training programs. Individual assistance, Harrison repeated. Direct aid to specific people. We don't typically provide direct aid, sir. Our model focuses on systemic solutions through established nonprofits. More efficient, better oversight. More efficient. Harrison nodded, though something sour rose in his throat. Of course. The meeting convened in the Foundation's main conference room. 17 people around a table discussing human suffering in terms of line items and quarterly projections. Harrison found himself staring out the window, watching pedestrians hurry past on Commonwealth Avenue. Any one of them could be homeless, he realized. Any one of them could be Delilah. Mr. Sterling? Margaret's voice cut through his distraction. Your thoughts on the Pine Street in proposal? Harrison blinked, refocusing on the spreadsheet projected on the wall. Numbers. Always numbers. Approve it, he said without reading the details. Sir, you might want to review the specifics. They're requesting a 30% increase from last year. A 30% increase to help homeless people find shelter. Harrison thought about his penthouse, about the $47 million deal sitting unsigned on his desk, about his parents crying over a stranger's kindness in a diner he'd never seen. Approve it, he said again. Double it. The room fell silent. Margaret's pen froze halfway through a note. Sir, double the allocation. And I want a full report on direct assistance programs. Individual aid, not just institutional funding. That's not really how we operate, sir. The oversight challenges alone. Harrison stood up, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. Then change how we operate. He walked out of the conference room, leaving 17 confused staff members and a budget that no longer made sense on paper but felt right for the first time in years. In his office, Harrison pulled out his phone and scrolled to his parents' number. His finger hovered over the call button for a full minute before he set the device aside. Not yet. He wasn't ready to admit that a homeless woman's story had shattered his carefully constructed distance from the world's pain. Wasn't ready to acknowledge that his father's mortality and his mother's tears had cracked something fundamental in his chest. The Jakarta contracts lay on his desk, still unsigned. $47 million waiting for his signature. Harrison picked up his pen, then set it down again. For the first time in 3 years, money felt like the smallest thing in the room. Harrison was signing the doubled homeless services allocation when Margaret burst into his office without knocking, her face flushed with urgency. "Sir, your parents are here. They're in the lobby and they're refusing to leave until they speak with you." Harrison's pen froze mid-signature. Through his office windows, he could see Eleanor and Frank Sterling in the Foundation's marble lobby 3 floors below, Eleanor gesticulating animatedly while Frank stood with his arms crossed in the particular stance that meant he wasn't budging. "Tell them I'm in a meeting. I tried. Your mother said she'd wait all day if necessary. She's asking about something called the Diner Angel Initiative." "The what?" Harrison set down his pen, a knot forming in his stomach. "Send them up." Margaret hesitated. "Sir, the board conference call starts in 20 minutes. Cancel it." "But the Tokyo investors." "Margaret." Harrison's voice carried the weight of a man whose patience had finally run out with his own life. "Cancel the call and send my parents up. Now." 5 minutes later, Eleanor Sterling swept into his office like a force of nature, Frank trailing behind with the resigned expression of a man who'd learned not to argue when his wife had made up her mind about something. Eleanor's eyes were bright with purpose, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the December wind, her green coat a splash of color against the office's muted grays. "Harrison Matthew Sterling," she said, using his full name like she had when he was 8 and had broken Mrs. Patterson's window with a baseball. "We need to talk." Frank closed the door behind them, his weathered face serious. "Son, your mother's got an idea." "I gathered that." Harrison gestured to the chairs across from his desk, but Eleanor remained standing, pacing in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows with the manic energy of someone who'd discovered a mission. "The woman from last night. Delilah. We have to find her." Harrison felt that familiar tightness in his chest, the same sensation he'd been fighting all morning. "Mom, I told Catherine." "I don't care what you told Catherine." Eleanor stopped pacing, fixing him with the look that had convinced a young Harrison to confess to every childhood transgression before she'd even asked the question. "This woman, this angel, she's living on the streets. In December. While we sit here in our warm offices and apartments talking about helping people in the abstract. The Foundation has protocols. Forget your protocols." Frank's voice cut through Harrison's objection like a saw through lumber. "Your mother spent all night crying. Good tears, Harrison. The kind she hasn't cried since before I got sick." Eleanor's eyes glistened. "She reminded me that there's still goodness in the world. Real goodness, not the kind you write checks for from a safe distance." Harrison stood up, moving to the window to avoid their eyes. Below, Boston spread out in all its December gray glory, thousands of people going about their lives while somewhere among them, a woman named Delilah was counting coins and looking for shelter. "What exactly are you proposing?" "We find her," Eleanor said simply. "We help her. Really help her, not just throw money at the problem and walk away feeling better about ourselves." "And how do you suggest we do that?" "Boston has approximately 1,500 homeless individuals on any given night. Do you want me to hire private investigators? Organize search parties?" Frank pulled out his phone, scrolling through photos. "We went back to the diner this morning. Talked to the waitress, Betty. Nice woman. She's been looking out for your Delilah for weeks." Your Delilah. The phrase hit Harrison like a physical blow. She's not my anything. Betty knows where she's been staying, Eleanor continued as if Harrison hadn't spoken. Under the Longfellow Bridge, and lately in some abandoned warehouse in Fort Point. She gave us the address. Harrison turned from the window, staring at his parents. You got the address of a homeless woman's shelter from a diner waitress? Betty's worried about her, Frank said defensively. Says Delilah's different from the usual folks who come through. educated, polite. Used to work in social services before she lost her job. Social services. Something shifted in Harrison's understanding, a piece of a puzzle he hadn't known he was solving. What kind of social services? Eleanor pulled a piece of paper from her purse, unfolding it carefully. Betty wrote down what she knew. Delilah Monroe, 28 years old. Used to work for Boston Children's Services until the budget cuts last spring. Lost her apartment, been on the streets for 3 months. Her father died while she was living in her car, Frank added quietly. Too proud to ask for help until it was too late. The room fell silent except for the distant hum of traffic 3 stories below. Harrison stared at the paper in his mother's hands, at the neat handwriting that reduced a woman's life to a few devastating facts. Delilah Monroe, a social worker who dedicated her life to helping others, only to find herself with nowhere to turn when crisis hit. What do you want me to do? His voice came out smaller than he'd intended. Eleanor smiled, the expression transforming her face. We want you to come with us. Right now. Today. To find her and offer her something real. Mom, I can't just. Yes, you can. Frank's voice was firm but gentle. You're the CEO of Sterling Enterprises and the director of a foundation worth $20 million. If you can't help one woman, then what's the point of any of it? Harrison looked at his desk, at the unsigned Jakarta contracts, at the doubled homeless services budget that had felt so meaningful an hour ago but now seemed like another layer of distance between himself and actual human need. The board will have questions. Let them question, Eleanor said. Your father is dying, Harrison. I'm watching the man I love waste away bit by bit, and yesterday a stranger reminded me that there's still beauty in the world. Still kindness. Still hope. Her voice broke on the last word, and Frank moved to put his arm around her shoulders. Your mother needs this, son. We both do. Harrison closed his eyes, feeling the weight of 3 years of careful emotional distance cracking like ice in spring. When he opened them again, his parents were watching him with expressions of hope and determination that reminded him of childhood birthday mornings when they believed anything was possible. Catherine, he called. His assistant appeared in the doorway so quickly she must have been listening outside. Sir. Cancel everything for the rest of the day. Reschedule the board call, push back the Yamamoto meeting, and tell legal that the Jakarta contracts will be signed tomorrow. Catherine's face cycled through confusion, concern, and resignation in the span of 3 seconds. Sir, are you feeling well? For the first time in months, Harrison found himself smiling. I'm feeling something, Catherine. I'm not sure what, but it's something. After Catherine left, muttering about impossible bosses and quarterly projections, Harrison grabbed his coat from the closet. A $1,000 cashmere overcoat that cost more than most people made in a month. For a moment, he considered changing into something less obviously expensive, then decided that hiding his wealth wouldn't make him any less of who he was. The warehouse address, he said to Frank. You have it. Frank nodded, pulling out his phone. 347, Summer Street. Betty said to look for the loading dock on the east side. Eleanor clapped her hands together like a child on Christmas morning. You'll really come with us? Harrison looked at his parents, at their faces bright with hope and purpose. His father, 70 years old and dying of cancer, more alive in this moment than Harrison had seen him in months. His mother, who'd found something to believe in again because a homeless woman had given away her last meal. I'll drive, he said. 30 minutes later, Harrison's black Bentley wound through the narrow streets of Fort Point. 3 Sterling family members crowded into the back seat like conspirators planning a revolution. Eleanor sat in the middle, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, while Frank stared out the window at the industrial landscape rolling past. There, Frank pointed to a 5-story brick building that had seen better decades. That's it. Harrison parked across the street, studying the structure. Broken windows on the upper floors, weeds growing through cracks in the pavement, graffiti tags that spoke of urban abandonment and municipal neglect. Somewhere inside that building, if Betty was right, a woman named Delilah was trying to survive another December day. "What exactly are we going to say to her?" Harrison asked, suddenly aware that he'd agreed to this mission without considering the practical details. Eleanor turned to look at him, her green eyes serious. "We're going to say thank you, and then we're going to ask if she'll let us help." "And if she says no?" "Then we respect her choice," Frank said quietly. "But we try anyway." Harrison stared at the building, at the loading dock where Betty had said they might find their angel. His phone buzzed with messages from Catherine, from board members, from investors whose calls he was ignoring to chase after a stranger's kindness in the ruins of Boston's industrial district. For the first time in 3 years, he didn't care about any of it. "Let's go find her," he said. As they crossed the street toward the abandoned warehouse, Harrison felt something shift inside his chest. The careful walls he'd built around his heart were cracking, letting in light he'd forgotten existed. Whether they found Delilah or not, whether she accepted their help or turned them away, he was no longer the man who'd woken up that morning worried only about contracts and quarterly projections. His father was dying, his mother was crying, and somewhere in the ruins of Boston's forgotten spaces, a woman who'd given away her last meal was about to change all their lives forever. The warehouse door stood slightly ajar, winter wind whistling through the gap like a promise of either redemption or heartbreak. There was only one way to find out which. The loading dock stretched into shadows that seemed to swallow the December afternoon light. Harrison followed his parents through the gap in the warehouse door, his expensive shoes crunching on broken glass and debris that spoke of years of abandonment. The air inside was thick with cold and the musty scent of decay, but underneath it all was something else. The faint smell of soap, as if someone had been trying to maintain dignity in impossible circumstances. "Hello," Eleanor called softly, her voice echoing in the cavernous space. "Delilah. We're the couple from the diner last night." Silence answered them, broken only by the distant drip of water and the whistle of wind through broken windows 4 stories above. Harrison's eyes adjusted to the dim light, revealing a vast empty space where machinery had once hummed with industrial purpose. Now it was nothing but concrete and shadows and the particular loneliness of places the city had forgotten. "There," Frank pointed toward the far corner, where cardboard had been arranged against the wall in a careful pattern. "Someone's been living here." They approached slowly, respectfully, like visitors to a shrine. The makeshift shelter was heartbreakingly organized. Cardboard flattened and layered for insulation. Newspaper arranged to block wind. A plastic tarp stretched overhead to catch any leaks from the floors above. In one corner, a small pile of belongings, a backpack with careful patches, a water bottle, a paperback book with a broken spine. Eleanor knelt beside the book, reading the title aloud. The Social Work Interview, a Guide for Human Service Professionals. Harrison's throat tightened. Even homeless, even sleeping on concrete in December, Delilah was still trying to hold on to her profession, still believing she might find her way back to helping others. "She's not here," Frank said quietly. "We wait," Eleanor replied, settling herself on a relatively clean section of concrete. "She has to come back eventually." Harrison checked his phone. 17 missed calls from Catherine. 23 unread emails marked urgent. The Jakarta deal that would close without his signature by 5 p.m. if he didn't return to sign the contracts. $47 million slipping away while he sat in an abandoned warehouse waiting for a homeless woman who might never show up. He turned off his phone. They waited in comfortable silence, 3 people from one world trying to understand life in another. After 20 minutes, they heard footsteps outside, careful and measured. Eleanor sat up straighter, her face bright with anticipation. A figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the gray afternoon light. Female, average height, moving with the cautious grace of someone who'd learned that strangers could mean either salvation or danger. As she stepped into the warehouse, Harrison got his first clear look at Delilah Monroe. She was nothing like what he'd expected. Even after 3 months on the streets, even with clothes that hung loose on her diminished frame, she carried herself with unmistakable dignity. Her skin was the color of rich earth, her dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail despite having no mirror to check her appearance. Her eyes were large and intelligent, the kind that seemed to see everything and judge nothing. Those eyes went wide when she spotted them in her makeshift home. "Eleanor? Frank?" Her voice carried genuine surprise and something that might have been concern. "What are you doing here? How did you find me?" Eleanor stood up, her hands clasped in front of her like a child confessing a secret. "We had to find you. After last night, after what you did for us, we couldn't just let it end there." Delilah's gaze shifted to Harrison, taking in his expensive coat and perfectly styled hair with the practiced assessment of someone who'd learned to read people quickly. "I'm sorry, I don't think we've met." "Harrison Sterling," he said, stepping forward. "These are my parents." The surname hit Delilah like a physical blow. She took a step backward, her expression shifting from cautious warmth to something approaching fear. "Sterling. As in Sterling Enterprises?" "Yes." "The Sterling Foundation?" Harrison nodded, watching emotions play across her face like storm clouds gathering on a clear day. "Your son." Delilah turned to Eleanor and Frank, her voice rising. "You're his parents." Eleanor reached toward her, but Delilah stepped away. "Sweetheart, let us explain." "Explain what?" "That you brought a billionaire to my home? That you told him where I live?" Delilah's voice cracked on the last word. "This is my home. This is all I have left, and you brought him here." The pain in her voice was so raw that Harrison felt it like a knife between his ribs. He'd expected gratitude, maybe embarrassment, possibly pride that wouldn't accept charity. He hadn't expected this bone-deep fear of exposure, of having her sanctuary invaded by the very forces that had failed her in the first place. "Delilah, please," Frank said gently. "We didn't mean any harm. We just wanted to thank you properly." "Thank me?" Delilah laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You want to thank me by dragging the foundation into this? The same foundation that funds the shelter that turns me away 3 nights a week because they don't have enough beds." Harrison felt heat rise in his cheeks. "We're working on expanding capacity." "Are you?" Delilah's eyes flashed. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're working on $47 million deals in Asia while people freeze to death 10 blocks from your office." The accuracy of her words hit Harrison like a physical blow. How did she know about the Jakarta deal? Then he remembered the newspaper she'd been reading in the diner, the business section that had covered Sterling Enterprises' latest expansion. "You don't understand," he began, but Delilah cut him off. "I understand perfectly. I used to work in social services, remember? I know exactly how foundation money gets distributed. I know about overhead costs and administrative fees and board meetings where people like me become line items in spreadsheets." Eleanor stepped between them, her voice firm but gentle. "That's enough. Both of you." She turned to Delilah, her green eyes soft with understanding. "You're right to be angry. You're right to be scared. But you're wrong about why we're here." "Then why are you here?" "Because you saved our lives last night." The simple statement hung in the air like a prayer. Delilah's defensive posture wavered slightly, confusion replacing anger in her expression. "I gave you soup. That's hardly—" "My husband is dying," Eleanor said quietly. "Pancreatic cancer." We've spent our savings on treatments that aren't working. Yesterday was the first time in weeks we'd left our apartment, and we couldn't even afford to eat. Frank moved to stand beside his wife, his weathered hand finding hers. We were giving up, ready to stop the treatments, stop fighting. Then you appeared at our table like an angel and reminded us that there's still goodness in the world. Delilah's eyes filled with tears. She tried to blink away. You don't understand. I had nothing else. That soup was everything I had left. We know, Eleanor whispered. That's why it mattered so much. Harrison watched this exchange, feeling like an intruder in a moment too sacred for his presence. These three people were sharing something he'd forgotten existed. Authentic human connection, unmediated by money or status or strategic advantage. Tell us about your father, Frank said gently. Eleanor mentioned you'd lost someone to cancer. Delilah's composure cracked completely. She sank onto her cardboard bed, her face in her hands. Jerome Monroe died 4 months ago. Postal worker for 37 years. Never missed a day of work until the cancer took him apart piece by piece. The words came out in a rush, as if a dam had finally burst. He was so proud when I got my social work degree. Said I was going to change the world, help kids like I'd been helped when I was in the system. Then the budget cuts came, and I lost my job, and the medical bills ate everything we had. Harrison found himself sitting on the concrete beside her, his expensive coat forgotten. You were in foster care? Delilah nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. From age 7 to 18. My mother overdosed when I was 6. Never knew my father until Jerome adopted me when I was 9. He saved my life, gave me a family, put me through college. And when he was dying, I couldn't even afford to take time off work to be with him. But you were there at the end? Eleanor asked softly. I was living in my car by then. Couldn't tell him I'd lost everything. Couldn't let him see how badly I'd failed. Delilah's voice broke completely. He died thinking I was successful, that his sacrifice had meant something. I let him die believing a lie. Frank knelt beside her, his construction worker's hands gentle on her shoulders. You didn't fail anybody, sweetheart. The system failed you. Same thing, Delilah whispered. No. Harrison's voice was firm, surprising himself with its intensity. It's not the same thing at all. She looked at him through her tears, and for the first time since she'd recognized his name, there was no fear in her expression. Only exhaustion and grief so deep it seemed to hollow out her bones. Your father was proud of you because you became someone who helps others, Harrison continued. Someone who gives away her last meal to strangers. That's not failure, Delilah. That's exactly who he raised you to be. Pretty words from someone who's never been hungry a day in his life. The accusation should have stung, but Harrison found himself nodding. You're right. I've never been hungry. Never been homeless. Never had to choose between rent and medication. He paused, looking around the warehouse that had become her refuge. But I've been empty. I've been lost. I've been so disconnected from what matters that I almost let my father die without telling him I love him. Delilah studied his face, searching for deception and finding only painful honesty. The Jakarta deal, she said quietly. $47 million. You haven't signed it yet. How did you? I read everything I can get my hands on. Newspapers, magazines, anything to keep my mind sharp. Sterling Enterprises has been front-page business news for 6 months. Harrison pulled out his phone, scrolling to Catherine's increasingly frantic messages. The deadline is 5 p.m. If I don't sign by then, 6 months of negotiations disappear. So why are you here instead of your office? The question hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they wanted to cross. Harrison looked at his parents, at their faces full of hope and love and the particular courage that came from having nothing left to lose. Then he looked at Delilah, at this woman who'd given away everything and somehow remained more whole than he'd been in years. Because $47 million doesn't matter if you don't have anyone to share it with, he said finally. For the first time since they'd arrived, Delilah smiled. It was small and tentative, but it transformed her face completely. Your parents raised a good man, she said softly. So did yours, Harrison replied. Outside, Boston continued its relentless December afternoon, but inside the abandoned warehouse, for people sat in the gathering dusk and discovered that sometimes the most important conversations happened in the spaces between what money could buy and what hearts could hold. The Jakarta deal would close without Harrison's signature at exactly 5:03 p.m. He never even noticed. The silence that followed Harrison's admission stretched between them like a held breath. Eleanor broke it first, her voice gentle but purposeful. It's going to be dark soon, she said, glancing toward the warehouse windows where December afternoon was already fading to gray. And it's supposed to snow tonight. Delilah pulled her thin coat tighter around her shoulders. I'll be fine. I've made it through worse. Have you eaten today? Frank asked, his paternal instincts sharper than his tact. The question hung in the air while Delilah calculated whether honesty was worth the risk of pity. Her stomach answered for her, growling audibly in the warehouse's silence. Harrison stood up, brushing concrete dust from his coat. There's a place called Antonio's about 6 blocks from here. Best Italian food in the city. My treat. I don't take charity, Delilah said quickly. It's not charity. It's dinner with people who'd like to get to know you better. Eleanor's voice carried the particular warmth of a mother who'd spent decades negotiating teenage stubbornness. Besides, you fed us last night. Turnabout is fair play. Delilah looked between the 3 Sterlings, reading the genuine invitation in their faces. When was the last time someone had wanted her company rather than simply tolerating her presence? When had she last sat at a table as a guest rather than a charity case? I'm not exactly dressed for a nice restaurant, she said, gesturing to her worn clothes and scuffed shoes. Harrison shrugged, a gesture that somehow made his expensive coat look less intimidating. Antonio doesn't care about clothes. He cares about whether you appreciate good food and honest conversation. 30 minutes later, they were seated in a corner booth at Antonio's, a family-owned restaurant that had survived 40 years in Boston's North End by serving food that tasted like love and treating every customer like extended family. The owner, a bear of a man named Tony Rossini, had taken one look at Harrison's party and immediately assumed they were celebrating something special. You look like people with good news, Tony had said, leading them to the best table in the house. Tonight, you eat like family. Now Delilah sat across from Harrison while Eleanor and Frank shared the other side of the booth, all of them studying menus in the warm glow of candles and Christmas lights. The restaurant hummed with the comfortable noise of families and couples sharing meals, and for the first time in months, Delilah felt like she belonged somewhere. The chicken parmigiana is extraordinary, Harrison said, setting down his menu. Though honestly, everything here is perfect. Delilah's eyes scanned the prices, her social worker's math calculating costs against dignity. The cheapest entree was $18, more than she'd spent on food in the past week combined. Eleanor noticed her hesitation. Order whatever looks good, sweetheart. This is our thank you, remember. When their server appeared, a college-aged girl with kind eyes and efficient movements, Harrison ordered wine for the table without consulting anyone. The Chianti, Maria. The good one Tony keeps for special occasions. Everything's a special occasion when you're here, Mr. Sterling, Maria replied with the easy familiarity of someone who'd served him before. Same table every time? Actually, no. Harrison glanced around the booth, at Delilah studying her menu and his parents holding hands like teenagers. "I think I'd like to try something different from now on." After they'd ordered, the wine arrived in a bottle that probably cost more than Delilah's monthly food budget when she'd had a monthly food budget. Harrison poured for everyone, his movements careful and respectful. "A toast," Frank said, raising his glass. "To unexpected angels and second chances." "To finding each other," Eleanor added. Harrison looked directly at Delilah. "To remembering what matters." Delilah lifted her glass, feeling the weight of the moment. "To people who see goodness in broken places." The wine was smooth and warm, spreading heat through her chest that had nothing to do with alcohol. When was the last time she'd been part of a toast? When had anyone looked at her like she was someone worth celebrating? "Tell us about your work," Eleanor said once their appetizers arrived. "What was it like being a social worker?" Delilah's face lit up for the first time since they'd met her. "It was everything. Frustrating and heartbreaking and absolutely necessary. I worked mostly with kids aging out of foster care, helping them transition to independent living." "Kids like you were," Harrison said quietly. "Exactly like I was. 18 years old, terrified, with nowhere to go and no one to help them figure out basic things like renting an apartment or opening a bank account." Delilah's voice grew stronger as she talked about her calling. "The system just cuts them loose on their birthday and expects them to magically become functional adults." Frank leaned forward, interested. "What kind of help did you provide?" "Everything. Life skills training, job placement assistance, emotional support. I had kids call me at 2 in the morning because they'd never learned how to handle a landlord dispute or because they were having panic attacks in their first apartment." "You gave them your personal number?" Harrison asked. "Of course. These kids had been abandoned by every adult who was supposed to protect them. I wasn't going to abandon them too." Delilah's eyes sparked with passion. "You don't fix broken trust by maintaining professional boundaries. You fix it by showing up, every time, no matter what." Eleanor smiled, the expression transforming her face. "You sound like Harrison when he was younger, before he learned to protect himself from caring too much." "Mom," Harrison warned, but there was no real heat in it. "It's true. You started that foundation because you wanted to change the world. When did you stop believing that was possible?" The question hung between them while their entrees arrived. Delilah watched Harrison's face cycle through emotions she recognized from her own mirror during the worst days. The look of someone who'd cared too much and been hurt too deeply to risk it again. "I stopped believing when I realized that good intentions weren't enough," Harrison said finally. "That systematic change required systematic thinking, not emotional responses." "Systematic thinking," Delilah repeated, cutting into her chicken parmigiana. "Is that what you call it when you approve budgets from a conference room instead of meeting the people you're supposed to help?" The words should have been an attack, but she delivered them with gentle curiosity rather than accusation. Harrison set down his fork, considering. "How do you help everyone if you can't stop focusing on individuals? How do you help anyone if you never focus on individuals?" They stared at each other across the table, two people who dedicated their lives to helping others but had arrived at completely different philosophies about how to do it effectively. Frank chuckled, breaking the tension. "You two are more alike than you want to admit." "How so?" Delilah asked. "You both care so much it hurts. The difference is that Harrison learned to hide from the hurt, and you learned to live with it." Eleanor nodded, squeezing her husband's hand. "Frank's right. You've both been wounded by the same system, just from different sides." "Different sides." Harrison's voice carried genuine confusion. Delilah set down her wine glass, studying his face. You tried to fix everything from the top down and got frustrated when people didn't fit into your formulas. I tried to fix everything from the bottom up and got crushed when the system I was fighting turned on me. So what's the answer? Maybe there isn't one answer. Delilah's voice was thoughtful. Maybe it takes both approaches working together. The conversation paused while they ate, each lost in thoughts about possibilities neither had considered before tonight. The food was extraordinary, but Delilah found herself more interested in watching Harrison's face as he processed ideas that clearly challenged his established worldview. "Can I ask you something?" she said eventually. "Of course. Why did you really come to find me today? Not the official version your parents gave. The real reason." Harrison was quiet for so long that Delilah thought he might not answer. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because when my mother told me what you'd done, it reminded me of who I used to be. Before I got scared. Before I decided that caring about individual people was inefficient and dangerous and too likely to break my heart. And I realized I'd rather have a broken heart than no heart at all." The admission settled over their table like snow, quiet and transformative. Eleanor reached across to squeeze Harrison's hand, her eyes bright with tears she didn't try to hide. "There's my son," she whispered. Maria appeared to clear their plates, her practiced eye reading the emotional weight of their conversation. "Dessert. Tony made tiramisu today. Says it's good for the soul." "Yes," Delilah said before anyone else could speak. "Please. All of us." As Maria disappeared toward the kitchen, Delilah looked around the table at these three people who'd entered her life less than 24 hours ago and somehow made her feel less alone than she had in months. "Can I tell you something?" she said. Three faces turned toward her expectantly. "This is the first time I've felt human in so long I'd forgotten what it was like." Her voice caught. "Thank you for seeing me as more than just another homeless person with a sad story. Thank you for seeing us as more than just another wealthy family trying to buy our way into feeling better about ourselves," Harrison replied. Frank raised his wine glass again. "To seeing each other clearly." They drank to that, and as the tiramisu arrived and conversation shifted to lighter topics, Delilah felt something she'd thought was lost forever. Hope. Not the desperate hope of survival that had sustained her through 3 months on the streets, but the warm hope of connection, of belonging, of being valued for who she was rather than what she could provide. Outside, snow had begun to fall, dusting the windows of Antonio's with white that would soon cover Boston in December magic. Inside, for people shared dessert and laughter and the particular intimacy that came from recognizing kindred spirits in unexpected places. Neither Harrison nor Delilah knew that in 3 hours, a misunderstanding would tear apart everything they were building tonight. For now, they were simply two wounded people discovering that maybe, just maybe, they could help each other heal. "What happens now?" Delilah asked as they lingered over coffee, none of them eager for the evening to end. Harrison looked at his parents, then back at her. "I was hoping you might help me figure that out." For the first time in months, Delilah Monroe smiled with her whole heart. Harrison arrived at his office to find Catherine pacing behind his desk like a caged animal, her usually perfect composure frayed at the edges. 3 board members sat in his conference chairs, their faces carrying the particular grimness of men who'd lost money overnight. The Jakarta deal collapsed, Catherine announced without preamble. Yamamoto flew back to Tokyo this morning. 6 months of negotiations, $47 million, gone because you couldn't be bothered to sign contracts. Harrison hung his coat in the closet with deliberate calm, though his stomach had dropped somewhere around his ankles. $47 million. 600 jobs. Market position in Asia that sterling enterprises might never recover. "There will be other deals," he said, though the words felt hollow even to him. Board member Charles Whitmore stood up, his silver hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. Other deals? Harrison, the Jakarta acquisition was our primary growth strategy for the next 18 months. Without it, our quarterly projections are meaningless. The shareholders are already asking questions, added Patricia Hayes, the foundation's chief financial officer. Stock price dropped 12% in after-hours trading. The financial press is calling it Sterling's mysterious meltdown. Catherine pulled up news articles on her tablet, scrolling through headlines that made Harrison's chest tighten. Wall Street Journal wants a statement. Forbes is running a piece about your erratic leadership decisions. And Bloomberg. She paused, her face pale. Bloomberg is suggesting the board might consider replacement options. Replacement. The word hit Harrison like a physical blow. Sterling Enterprises was his life's work, the company he'd built from his father's construction business into a multi-billion-dollar empire. The idea of losing it, of being voted out by his own board, was unthinkable. But as he looked at their faces, at the calculation in their eyes as they weighed his value against his recent performance, Harrison realized the unthinkable was becoming increasingly possible. "I need detailed damage assessment reports by noon," he said finally. "Market analysis, competitor positioning, recovery strategies. We'll figure this out." The board members filed out with expressions that suggested they were already figuring it out, just not in ways that included him. After they left, Catherine closed the door and turned to face him with the look of someone preparing to deliver terminal news. "There's more," she said quietly. Of course there was. "Tell me." "The homeless woman, Delilah Monroe." Someone leaked photos to the press. Harrison's blood turned to ice. "What photos?" Catherine's tablet showed images that made his stomach clench with rage and terror. Harrison's Bentley parked outside the warehouse. The three Sterlings walking into the abandoned building. A long-distance shot of them sitting around Delilah's cardboard shelter, his expensive coat stark against the industrial decay. "How?" His voice was deadly quiet. "We're not sure. Could have been anyone with a phone and a telephoto lens." The photos hit social media around midnight, went viral by 3 a.m. She scrolled to more images. Harrison and Delilah walking into Antonio's, laughing over dinner, their faces animated in conversation. Pictures that told a story the press was already spinning into scandal. "The narrative is writing itself," Catherine continued. Billionaire CEO abandons major business deal to pursue romance with homeless woman. The headlines are brutal. Harrison's phone buzzed with notifications he'd been ignoring all morning. Text after text from numbers he didn't recognize, social media tags, news alerts. His private life, their private evening, turned into public entertainment. "She doesn't know yet," Catherine said gently. "But she will soon. This story is everywhere." The implications crashed over Harrison like a tsunami. Delilah's face would be on newspaper websites and social media feeds. Her story, her dignity, her carefully guarded privacy, all violated for the entertainment of strangers who would judge her life from the safety of their breakfast tables. "Find her," Harrison said. "Bring her here. Now." "Sir, I'm not sure that's—" "Find her, Catherine, before she sees this from someone else." But it was already too late. Delilah had claimed her usual table in the library's periodical section, surrounded by newspapers and magazines that let her stay current with a world that had mostly forgotten she existed. This morning felt different, though. This morning, she had something to look forward to. Harrison had walked her back to the warehouse the night before, both of them reluctant to end an evening that had felt like stepping back into her real life. They'd made tentative plans to meet for coffee, to continue conversations that had revealed depths neither had expected to find. For the first time in months, Delilah had fallen asleep thinking about possibilities instead of survival. She was reading the business section, smiling at an article about sustainable development initiatives, when she heard her name spoken in hushed tones at the next table. Delilah Monroe. Says here she used to be a social worker before she became homeless. Delilah's head snapped up. Two women in their 50s were hunched over a tablet, their voices carrying the particular excitement of people consuming scandal with their morning coffee. Look at this photo. She's actually pretty under all that. You know. Poor thing probably thought she hit the lottery when he showed up. The words hit Delilah like ice water. She stood up slowly, moving toward their table with the careful control of someone trying not to cause a scene. "Excuse me," she said quietly. "I couldn't help overhearing. What were you looking at?" The women exchanged glances, suddenly aware they'd been discussing someone within earshot. The one with the tablet, a blonde woman in expensive yoga clothes, turned the screen toward Delilah with obvious reluctance. The headline made her knees buckle. Billionaire's charity case. Sterling heir abandons major deal for homeless lover. Below it, photos that turned her stomach. Her face, clearly recognizable, sitting in the warehouse that had been her only refuge. Harrison's expensive car parked outside like a billboard advertising the gulf between their worlds. Pictures of them at dinner, her worn clothes stark against the restaurant's elegant atmosphere. "Oh, honey," the second woman said, her voice thick with pity. "I'm so sorry. We didn't realize." But Delilah was already walking away, her hands shaking as she gathered her belongings. Every face in the library seemed to be staring at her now, recognition dawning in expressions that shifted from curiosity to pity to judgment. Her phone, the prepaid cell she'd managed to keep active, buzzed with notifications. Voice messages from numbers she didn't recognize. Text messages from reporters. Friend requests on social media from strangers who wanted to gawk at the homeless woman who'd caught a billionaire's attention. She made it outside before the panic attack hit. Sitting on the library steps in the December cold, gasping for air while snow fell around her, Delilah scrolled through articles that reduced her life to entertainment. Sterling slumming. When charity becomes romance. From boardroom to cardboard. CEO's bizarre obsession. Homeless and hopeful. The woman who captured a billionaire's heart. Each headline was worse than the last, but the comments were what broke her heart completely. Hundreds of strangers dissecting her appearance, her motives, her worthiness. People who'd never spent a night without shelter debating whether she was a gold digger or a victim or some combination of both. Clearly angling for a payday, wrote someone named Jennifer B. 47. Probably planned the whole thing. Poor guy doesn't realize she's just using him, added Truth Teller 99. Hope he gets a prenup. Actually kind of sweet, offered Mom of 3. Maybe money can't buy happiness, but it can buy love? Love. The word made Delilah's stomach clench. Was that what people thought this was? Some fairy tale romance between a billionaire and a homeless woman? Did they think she'd orchestrated her own poverty for the chance to meet Harrison Sterling? Her phone rang. Catherine Wells, according to the caller ID. Miss Monroe? This is Catherine, Mr. Sterling's assistant. He'd like to see you immediately. I can send a car. No. Delilah's voice was steadier than she felt. Tell Mr. Sterling that Miss Monroe is unavailable for photo opportunities today. Miss Monroe, please. This isn't what it looks like. Harrison is devastated about the leak. He wants to explain. There's nothing to explain. Delilah stood up, brushing snow from her coat. I understand perfectly. She hung up before Catherine could respond, then turned off her phone completely. Around her, Boston continued its morning routine, but now every passerby felt like a potential photographer, every glance a judgment. The fairy tale was over before it had really begun. Harrison stood at his office windows, staring down at the street where photographers had gathered like vultures sensing carrion. Catherine had spent 2 hours trying to reach Delilah, but her phone went straight to voicemail after their brief conversation. "The damage control team is here," Catherine announced, gesturing toward the conference room where crisis management specialists waited with presentations about narrative control and public relations strategy. "Cancel them," Harrison said without turning around. "Sir, cancel the damage control. Cancel the press statements. Cancel all of it. Harrison, we need to address this situation before it gets worse." He turned to face her, and Catherine stepped back at the expression in his eyes. She'd worked for Harrison Sterling for 5 years, had seen him angry, frustrated, disappointed. She'd never seen him look broken. "It can't get worse, Catherine. We've destroyed her. We didn't leak those photos. We might as well have. I dragged her into my world without thinking about the consequences. I turned her into a public spectacle because I was so focused on feeling good about myself that I forgot she was a real person with real dignity." Catherine's expression softened. "She'll understand. When she has time to process." "Understand what?" "That I'm exactly what she thought I was when she first heard my name. A wealthy man who takes what he wants without considering the cost to others." Harrison's phone buzzed with another call from a reporter. He'd stopped answering them hours ago, but they kept trying. The story had everything the media loved: wealth, poverty, romance, scandal. The perfect narrative to drive clicks and sell newspapers while destroying the lives of real people. "Find out who took those photos," he said quietly. "I want to know who invaded her privacy and turned her pain into entertainment." "Harrison." "Find them, Catherine. And then make sure they understand that if they publish one more photo of Delilah Monroe without her explicit consent, Sterling Enterprises will spend whatever it takes to make their lives very difficult." After Catherine left, Harrison pulled out his phone and scrolled through the articles one more time. Each headline felt like a knife between his ribs, but he forced himself to read every word, to see what Delilah was seeing about herself and their connection. By noon, the story had gone national. Cable news shows were discussing billionaire philanthropy and poverty tourism. Social media influencers were posting videos about performative charity and savior complexes. Everyone had an opinion about Harrison Sterling and Delilah Monroe, but none of them knew either person involved. The worst part was that some of the criticism was accurate. He had approached her from a position of privilege, had inserted himself into her life because it made him feel better about his own emptiness. He'd been so concerned with his own spiritual redemption that he'd failed to protect her from the consequences of his attention. At 2:30 p.m., Eleanor called. "Harrison, I just saw the news. That poor girl. We have to do something." "What can we do, Mom? We caused this. All of us. We invaded her home, dragged her into our world, and now she's paying the price for our need to feel better about ourselves." "That's not what happened." "Isn't it?" Harrison sank into his chair, suddenly feeling every one of his 35 years. "I wanted to be the hero of her story so badly that I forgot she was the hero of her own story." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. "What are you going to do?" Harrison looked out at the photographers still gathering on the street below, at the city where somewhere a woman was probably hiding from cameras and judgment because she'd shown kindness to his parents. "I'm going to leave her alone," he said finally. "It's the least I can do after everything else." But even as he said the words, Harrison knew that leaving Delilah alone was the last thing he wanted to do. The problem was that what he wanted had already caused enough damage. By evening, Homeless and Hopeful was trending on social media. Delilah Monroe had become famous for all the wrong reasons, and Harrison Sterling had learned that sometimes the cost of caring was higher than either person could afford to pay. The snow continued falling over Boston, covering the city in white that would soon turn gray with traffic and time. Some things, once broken, could never be made clean again. Delilah hadn't slept. She'd spent the night sitting against the warehouse wall, her knees drawn to her chest, watching snow accumulate on the broken windows while her phone remained turned off in her backpack. The silence felt like a blessing and a curse. No more notification sounds alerting her to fresh humiliation, but also no way to know if the story was dying down or growing worse. She'd ventured out once, around midnight, to use the restroom at a 24-hour gas station. The clerk, a tired-looking man in his 50s, had stared at her with obvious recognition before pretending to busy himself with inventory. She'd heard him whispering into his phone as she'd walked away. "Yeah, it's definitely her. The homeless lady from the news." Now, as dawn painted the warehouse walls gray, Delilah faced a choice that felt impossible. She could stay hidden until the media attention died down, living like a fugitive in her own city. Or she could leave Boston entirely, start over somewhere else with nothing but the clothes on her back and the bitter knowledge that kindness was a luxury she couldn't afford. Both options felt like surrender. Her stomach cramped with hunger, but the thought of going to Betty's diner or any other public place made her skin crawl. How long before someone recognized her face? How long before her picture ended up on social media again, this time with captions about her ongoing decline or failure to capitalize on her 15 minutes of fame? Delilah pulled out the social work textbook she'd been carrying for months, running her fingers over the worn cover. The Social Work Interview, a guide for human service professionals. She'd read it cover to cover 3 times, clinging to the hope that somehow, someday, she'd find her way back to helping others. Now it felt like a joke. How could she help anyone when she couldn't even protect herself from becoming a cautionary tale? The sound of footsteps outside made her freeze. Careful, measured steps approaching the loading dock. Not the heavy boots of security guards or the quick pace of someone passing by, but deliberate movement by someone who knew exactly where they were going. Delilah grabbed her backpack, ready to run deeper into the warehouse if necessary. 3 months on the streets had taught her that strangers rarely brought good news. "Delilah!" A woman's voice, familiar but unexpected. "It's Eleanor. Frank and I would like to talk to you, if that's all right." Eleanor and Frank Sterling appeared in the doorway, both looking older than they had 2 days ago. Eleanor's usually perfect hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore jeans and a wool coat that had seen better years. Frank carried a thermos and a paper bag that smelled like fresh coffee and breakfast pastries. "We're alone," Eleanor said gently, noting Delilah's wariness. "Harrison doesn't know we're here." Delilah remained pressed against the wall, every muscle tensed for flight. "You shouldn't be here. Someone might see you, take more pictures." "Let them," Frank said, settling himself on a piece of concrete debris with the careful movements of a man whose body was failing him. "We're not ashamed of being here. You should be. I'm a liability now. A scandal. Everything I touch turns into a headline." Eleanor approached slowly, her hands visible and empty except for the coffee she held out like a peace offering. "You're not a scandal, sweetheart. You're a woman who showed us kindness, and the world punished you for it." "Same thing," Delilah whispered, echoing the words she'd said about failure just days before. "No." Frank's voice carried the authority of 7 decades on Earth. "It's not the same thing at all." Delilah accepted the coffee with hands that shook from cold and exhaustion. The warmth spread through her fingers like forgiveness. "Why are you here?" Eleanor sat beside her on the cardboard, her expensive coat forgotten in the dirt. "Because our son is miserable. Because you're miserable. And because 2 people who care about each other shouldn't let the opinions of strangers tear them apart." "Care about each other?" Delilah's laugh was hollow. "We've known each other for 48 hours. This isn't some grand romance. It's a publicity nightmare." "Is it?" Frank opened the paper bag, revealing fresh croissants that made Delilah's mouth water despite her emotional turmoil. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like two broken people who found something beautiful together and got scared when the world tried to take it away. Delilah bit into a croissant, the buttery pastry melting on her tongue like a small miracle. When had she last eaten real food? When had anyone brought her breakfast as if her comfort mattered? The whole world thinks I'm a gold digger, she said around the pastry. Half the internet is convinced I orchestrated my own homelessness to meet a billionaire, and the other half thinks I'm a charity case who doesn't deserve his attention. The world doesn't know you, Eleanor said simply. We do. You've known me for 2 days. I've known you my whole life. Eleanor's voice was soft but certain. You're the woman who gives away her last meal to strangers. You're the social worker who gave foster kids her personal phone number. You're the daughter who protected her dying father from knowing how badly she was struggling. Each description hit Delilah like a physical blow, not because they were cruel but because they were kind. Because they saw her as more than her circumstances, more than the headlines that had reduced her to a cautionary tale. Harrison sees you too, Frank added quietly. Sees who you really are underneath all the noise. Then why hasn't he called? Why hasn't he tried to find me? Eleanor and Frank exchanged the look of parents who understood their child better than he understood himself. Because he's terrified, Eleanor said. Because he thinks he caused this mess and that staying away from you is some noble gesture of protection. Because he's an idiot, Frank added, earning a sharp look from his wife. A well-meaning idiot, but still an idiot. Despite everything, Delilah found herself smiling. He did cause this mess. If he hadn't shown up here, if we hadn't gone to dinner, none of this would have happened. And would that have been better? Eleanor asked. Would you rather have never met him? Never had someone see you as more than just another homeless person? Never had one evening where you felt like yourself again? The question hung in the cold air while Delilah considered her answer. Yes, the media attention was horrible. Yes, her privacy had been violated and her dignity trampled. But she couldn't honestly say she regretted meeting Harrison, couldn't pretend that their conversation at Antonio's hadn't reminded her of who she used to be. What's he doing now? She asked quietly. Frank pulled out his phone, scrolling through news articles. Refusing all interviews. His assistant says he's locked himself in his office and won't see anyone except board members who want to discuss his erratic recent behavior. The business deal he missed. How bad was it? Bad enough that they're talking about replacing him, Eleanor admitted. $47 million, apparently. Plus the stock price dropped, and the board is questioning his judgment. The numbers hit Delilah like a sledgehammer. $47 million. Harrison had lost $47 million because he'd chosen to spend time with her instead of signing contracts. No wonder the media was calling him erratic. No wonder his own board was questioning his competence. I destroyed his life, she whispered. You didn't destroy anything, Frank said firmly. Life happened. Messy, complicated, beautiful life that doesn't fit into quarterly projections or 5-year plans. Eleanor reached into her purse, pulling out a folded piece of paper. He wrote you a letter. Asked us to give it to you if we found you first. Delilah stared at the envelope as if it might explode. Her name was written across it in Harrison's careful handwriting, the letters pressed deep into the paper like he'd written it multiple times. I don't know if I can read it, she admitted. Then don't. Not yet. Eleanor tucked the letter into Delilah's coat pocket. But maybe think about what you want to say back to him. About whether you're going to let fear make this decision for you. They sat in comfortable silence while Delilah finished her breakfast, watching snow fall through the broken windows. For the first time since the photos had appeared online, she felt something other than shame and anger. She felt the stirring of possibility, the dangerous hope that maybe the story didn't have to end with both of them retreating to opposite corners of their separate worlds. "He's at his office now?" she asked eventually. Frank nodded. "Probably will be all day. Catherine says he's been sleeping there since the story broke." Delilah stood up, brushing crumbs from her clothes. "I need to think. About what I want. About what I'm brave enough to fight for." Eleanor smiled, the expression lighting up her face. "That's all anyone can ask for. The courage to choose what matters most." After they left, Delilah sat alone in the warehouse holding Harrison's letter like a talisman. Outside, Boston continued its morning routine, but inside her chest, something was shifting. The anger was still there, and the hurt, and the fear of being hurt again. But underneath it all was a question that wouldn't leave her alone. What if Eleanor was right? What if this wasn't about publicity or charity or any of the ugly motivations the world wanted to assign to their connection? What if it was simply about two people who'd recognized something valuable in each other and were too scared to fight for it? Delilah pulled out her phone and turned it on for the first time in 24 hours. The notifications flooded in, hundreds of them, but she ignored them all. Instead, she opened her contacts and scrolled to a number she'd memorized but never called. Sterling Foundation. Main office. Her finger hovered over the call button while she gathered courage she wasn't sure she possessed. Outside, a siren wailed in the distance, the sound of a city full of emergencies and broken things that sometimes, against all odds, found ways to heal. Delilah took a deep breath and made the call. Harrison sat at his desk surrounded by financial reports that painted his recent decisions in stark, unforgiving numbers. The Jakarta deal wasn't just about $47 million. He was learning. It had been the cornerstone of Sterling Enterprises' expansion strategy, the foundation for 3 other deals currently in negotiation. Without it, the company's projected growth for the next 2 years was essentially fantasy. Catherine knocked and entered without waiting for permission, her face carrying news he probably didn't want to hear. "The board wants an emergency meeting at 2 p.m., she announced. Charles Whitmore specifically requested a discussion about leadership stability and fiduciary responsibility. Leadership stability. Corporate speak for, "We're thinking about firing you." "Fine," Harrison said without looking up from the reports. "Schedule it." "Harrison." Catherine's voice was gentler than usual. "They're serious this time. Patricia Hayes has been making calls to other board members. There's talk about a vote of no confidence." The words should have terrified him. Sterling Enterprises was his life's work, his identity, his purpose. The idea of losing it should have sent him into crisis mode, calling in favors and shoring up support and doing whatever it took to protect his position. Instead, he felt nothing but exhaustion. "Maybe they're right," he said quietly. Catherine blinked in surprise. "Sir, maybe I'm not fit to run this company anymore. Maybe someone who cares more about quarterly profits than individual people would do a better job." "You don't mean that." Harrison looked up at her, this woman who'd been his right hand for 5 years, who'd watched him build walls around his heart brick by brick. "Don't I? When was the last time I made a decision based on what was right instead of what was profitable? You double the homeless services allocation 2 days ago. After meeting Delilah, everything good I've done lately has been because of her influence." Harrison stood up, moving to the window where photographers still waited like vultures. "She made me remember who I used to be before I got scared of feeling too much. So fight for her. And fight for the company. You don't have to choose." "I think I do." Harrison's phone buzzed with another call from a reporter. "The board is right, Catherine. I've been distracted, erratic, making decisions based on emotion instead of analysis. Maybe it's time for someone else to take over." "What about Delilah?" The question hit him like a physical blow. What about Delilah? She was probably hiding somewhere, reading about herself in articles that reduced her dignity to entertainment, hating him for dragging her into his world without considering the consequences. What about her? I've done enough damage. The best thing I can do for Delilah Monroe is stay out of her life completely. Catherine stared at him for a long moment, her expression cycling through frustration, concern, and something that looked like disappointment. You know what I think, she said finally. Tell me. I think you're giving up because it's easier than fighting for something that matters. I think you'd rather lose everything than risk being hurt again. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Harrison wanted to deny it, to explain that he was being noble and selfless by stepping away. But Catherine had known him too long, had seen too much, for lies to work between them. Maybe you're right, he admitted. But some risks are too dangerous to take. And some things are too important to lose. After Catherine left, Harrison sat alone with his cowardice and his regrets. His phone showed 17 missed calls from board members, 43 unread emails marked urgent, and one voice message from his parents that he couldn't bring himself to play. At 11:47 a.m., Catherine buzzed his intercom. Sir, there's someone here to see you. Says she doesn't have an appointment, but it's about Delilah Monroe. Harrison's heart stopped. Send them up. But when his office door opened, it wasn't Delilah who walked in. It was Betty Sullivan from the diner, her weathered face serious and her eyes blazing with a particular fire of someone who'd had enough of watching good people destroy themselves. Mr. Sterling, she said without preamble. We need to talk. Betty Sullivan stood in the doorway of Harrison's office like an avenging angel in a waitress uniform. Her silver hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun and her eyes blazing with righteous fury. She carried a canvas bag slung over her shoulder and moved with the purposeful stride of someone who'd made up her mind about something important. Betty, Harrison said, standing up from his desk. I wasn't expecting. Course you weren't. Rich folks never expect working people to show up in their fancy offices. Betty stepped into the room, her gaze sweeping over the expensive furniture and floor-to-ceiling windows with obvious distaste. But here I am anyway, because somebody needs to talk sense into you before you ruin the best thing that's happened to either of you. Catherine appeared in the doorway behind Betty, her face apologetic. Sir, I tried to explain that you were busy, but she was very insistent. It's fine, Catherine. Close the door, please. Harrison gestured to the chairs across from his desk. Betty, please sit. Can I get you coffee? Water. I didn't come here for refreshments. Betty remained standing, her hands planted firmly on her hips. I came here because that girl is sitting in my diner right now, crying into a cup of coffee she can't afford, while you're up here in your ivory tower feeling sorry for yourself. Harrison's heart lurched. She's at the diner? Is she all right? Is she all right? Betty's voice rose to a pitch that could probably be heard 3 floors down. Her face is plastered all over the internet like she's some kind of circus freak. Reporters have been calling my restaurant asking for quotes about the homeless woman who captured a billionaire's heart. And you want to know if she's all right. Shame flooded Harrison's chest, hot and suffocating. I didn't want any of this to happen. I was trying to protect her by staying away. Protect her. Betty laughed, but there was no humor in it. You want to protect her? Then stop being a coward and go fight for her. You don't understand. The media attention, the scrutiny, my board wants to fire me. Your board can kiss my grits, Betty snapped. And the media can mind their own business. You think Delilah cares about any of that? Harrison sank into his chair, feeling smaller than he had since childhood. I think she's better off without me complicating her life. Betty reached into her canvas bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper, slapping it down on Harrison's desk with enough force to make his coffee mug jump. "Read it." Harrison unfolded the paper, recognizing Delilah's careful handwriting immediately. It was a letter, written on diner napkins and held together with tape. "Harrison, Betty made me write this after I spent an hour crying into her coffee and scaring away her regular customers. She says if I don't tell you how I feel, she's going to march into your office and do it herself. Knowing Betty, she probably means it. I've been thinking about everything that's happened. About the photos, the headlines, the way strangers are dissecting our lives like we're characters in some soap opera. And yes, it's horrible. Yes, it hurts to see my father's death and my homelessness turned into entertainment for people who've never missed a meal in their lives. But you know what hurts more? The thought that we're going to let them win. That we're going to let fear and embarrassment destroy something real because it's easier than fighting for it. I've been scared my whole life, Harrison. Scared of being abandoned again, scared of trusting people who might leave, scared of caring about anything I might lose. 3 months on the streets didn't make me homeless. Fear did. Fear made me too proud to ask for help when I needed it. Fear convinced me I deserved to suffer alone. I'm tired of being scared. I'm tired of letting other people decide what my life is worth. If you're reading this, it means Betty kept her promise to deliver it. It also means you haven't completely given up on us, whatever us might become. I'm not asking for promises or declarations or anything that looks like a fairy tale ending. I'm just asking if you want to find out what's possible when two people stop running from each other. Meet me at the place where this started, where you first saw me as someone worth knowing. Tonight at 8 p.m., if you're brave enough. If you don't come, I'll understand. But I hope you do. Delilah. P.S. Betty says to tell you that if you break my heart, she knows where you live and she's not afraid to use her cast iron skillet on rich boys who don't appreciate good women. Harrison read the letter twice, his hands shaking by the time he finished. When he looked up, Betty was watching him with the satisfied expression of someone whose plan was working exactly as intended. She wrote this at your diner? At table 12, same spot where she sat the night she met your parents. Took her 47 minutes and 16 napkins, but she got it all out. Betty's voice softened slightly. That girl's been carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders for so long she forgot what it felt like to have someone want to share the load. Harrison stood up, pacing to the window where the photographers still waited. The media will never leave us alone. Every date, every conversation, every moment will be scrutinized and judged. Is that fair to her? Fair? Betty snorted. Nothing about Delilah's life has been fair. She lost her mother to drugs, got bounced around foster care, watched her adopted father die of cancer while she lost everything trying to save him. You think a few nosy reporters are going to scare her off? The board meeting is at 2 p.m. They're going to fire me. So what? You got enough money to last 10 lifetimes. You think Delilah's going to care if you're a billionaire CEO or just a regular millionaire with a good heart? Harrison turned to face Betty, this woman who'd shown more wisdom in 10 minutes than his entire board of directors had in years. What if I hurt her? What if I'm too damaged to be what she needs? Betty's expression gentled, and for the first time since entering his office, she looked at him with something approaching maternal affection. Honey, we're all damaged. The question is whether you're brave enough to let someone help you heal. She gathered her bag and headed toward the door, then stopped and turned back. That girl gave away her last meal to feed strangers. You really think she's going to judge you for having feelings? After Betty left, Harrison sat alone with Delilah's letter, reading it again and again until he'd memorized every word. Outside his windows, Boston sparkled in the December afternoon light, and somewhere in the city, A woman was waiting to see if he was brave enough to choose love over fear. At 1:45 p.m., Catherine knocked on his door. "Sir, the board members are arriving for the meeting." Harrison looked at his reflection in the window, at the man who'd spent 3 years building walls around his heart because caring too much hurt too badly. Then he thought about Delilah, sleeping on cardboard in December because she'd been too proud to ask for help. About Eleanor and Frank, facing cancer with dignity and grace. About all the ways love required courage he'd forgotten he possessed. "Catherine." "Yes, sir." "Cancel the meeting." "Sir, I don't think they'll." "Cancel it. And draft a letter to the board. I'm resigning as CEO of Sterling Enterprises, effective immediately." Catherine's face went white. "Harrison, you can't." "I can. And I am." Harrison grabbed his coat from the closet, feeling lighter than he had in years. "I'm also doubling my personal contributions to the Sterling Foundation and taking a hands-on role in homeless services. Real hands-on. No more boardroom philanthropy." "Where are you going?" Harrison paused at the door, thinking about everything he needed to do before 8 p.m. Apologies to make, bridges to rebuild, courage to find. "I'm going to buy groceries," he said. "Groceries." Someone very wise once told me that food tastes better when it's shared. At Betty's Diner, Cambridge Street, the diner was nearly empty when Harrison arrived, carrying 2 bags of groceries and wearing jeans and a sweater instead of his usual expensive suit. Betty looked up from wiping down tables, her face breaking into the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," she said. "Wasn't sure you'd show. Is she here?" Betty nodded toward the corner booth, the same one where Delilah had sat the night she'd given away her meal to his parents. She was there now, wearing a clean purple sweater that Harrison suspected was borrowed from Betty, her hair freshly washed and pulled back in a simple ponytail. She looked up when the bell above the door chimed, her dark eyes meeting his across the space. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Harrison walked slowly toward her table, setting the grocery bags on the floor before sliding into the seat across from her. "You came," Delilah said softly. "You asked me to." Harrison reached across the table, his fingers hovering just short of hers. "I'm sorry. For everything. For the photos, for the headlines, for not protecting you from all of this. You couldn't have known. I should have been more careful. Should have thought about what bringing you into my world would cost you." Delilah turned her hands palm up, an invitation. Harrison took it, their fingers intertwining across the Formica table. "I don't want to be protected from your world," she said. "I want to be part of it. Just like I want you to be part of mine. My world comes with photographers and board meetings and more money than any person needs. Yours comes with." Harrison paused, looking around the diner that had become sacred space for both of them. With real people and genuine kindness and knowing what actually matters. "So we'll build a new world together. One that has the best parts of both." Harrison squeezed her hands gently. "I resigned as CEO today." Delilah's eyes widened. "Because of me?" "Because of us. Because I realized that running a company meant nothing if I didn't have someone to share it with." Harrison smiled, feeling the truth of it settle in his chest. "I'm still on the foundation board, and I'm doubling my charitable giving. But I want to do the work myself now. Real work, with real people. The Jakarta deal was never going to make me happy. But you might." Delilah leaned forward, her eyes bright with possibilities. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I love you." The words came out easier than Harrison had expected. 3 syllables that contained everything he'd been too scared to feel for 3 years. "I love your strength and your kindness and the way you see goodness in broken places." I love that you gave away your last meal to strangers and that you still believe in helping people even after the world let you down." Tears spilled down Delilah's cheeks, but she was smiling through them. "I love you too. I love that you chose to find me instead of signing contracts. I love that you see me as more than my circumstances. I love that you're brave enough to risk everything for something real." Betty appeared beside their table with coffee and the knowing smile of someone whose matchmaking had worked exactly as planned. "About time you two figured it out. Now, what's in those grocery bags?" Harrison grinned, reaching for the bags he'd brought. "Ingredients. I thought maybe we could cook dinner together. Something simple, something shared." As he unpacked fresh pasta and vegetables and ingredients for a sauce that would feed the diner's late-night customers, Delilah watched with wonder and growing joy. This man who could afford any restaurant in the city wanted to cook in a neighborhood diner, to serve food to people who might not otherwise have enough. "Together?" she asked. "Together," Harrison confirmed. "If you'll have me." Delilah stood up, moving around the table to take his hands again. "Harrison Sterling, I'll have you any way I can get you. Rich or poor, CEO or cook, famous or forgotten. As long as you keep seeing me the way you did that first night. How's that? Like I matter." Harrison cupped her face in his hands, thumbs brushing away the tears that continued to fall. "You matter more than anything else in my world." When he kissed her, the diner erupted in applause from the half-dozen customers who'd been pretending not to watch their reunion. Betty wiped her eyes with her apron and called out to Tommy in the kitchen. "Clear some space back there. We've got some lovebirds who want to cook dinner for everyone." As Harrison and Delilah moved toward the kitchen, hands clasped together, the bell above the diner door chimed with new arrivals. Eleanor and Frank Sterling entered, their faces bright with hope and love and the particular joy of parents who'd watched their son find his way back to his heart. "Room for 2 more cooks?" Eleanor asked. "Always," Delilah replied, opening her arms to embrace the woman who'd become a second mother in the space of 3 days. Outside, snow began to fall again over Boston, dusting the city in fresh white that promised new beginnings. Inside Betty's diner, for people who'd found each other across impossible odds stood together in the kitchen, preparing food to share with strangers who might be hungry on a cold December night. The photographers had finally given up and gone home. The headlines would fade in time, replaced by newer scandals and fresher stories. But love, real love built on mutual respect and shared purpose, would endure long after the world had moved on to its next entertainment. 1 year later, the transformed warehouse buzzed with celebration as Boston's mayor cut the ribbon on the Sterling Community Center. But Harrison Sterling Monroe barely noticed the cameras flashing. His attention was focused on his wife, Delilah, as she guided a group of former foster children through the job training center that had become her life's work. "Mr. Sterling Monroe?" A reporter from the Boston Globe approached with a microphone. "Can you comment on how your life has changed since you resigned from Sterling Enterprises?" Harrison smiled, the expression genuine in a way it never had been during his CEO days. "Best decision I ever made. Turns out there's more satisfaction in helping one person find housing than in closing million-dollar deals." The reporter scribbled notes. "And the company. How has Sterling Enterprises fared under new leadership?" "Better than ever," Harrison said truthfully. His former CFO, Patricia Hayes, had taken over as CEO and increased profits by 23% in her first year. "Turns out I was holding them back. Patricia understands profit margins better than I ever did, and the board couldn't be happier." What he didn't mention was that his departure had freed him to liquidate 60% of his Sterling Enterprises stock, providing the funding for 3 community centers, a scholarship program for former foster children, and a legal fund that had successfully prosecuted the freelance photographer who'd violated Delilah's privacy. The man now faced federal charges for stalking and invasion of privacy, and every major news outlet in Boston had agreed to new ethical guidelines about photographing vulnerable populations. "Honey!" Delilah appeared at his elbow, her face glowing with pride and exhaustion. "The Channel 5 crew wants to interview us together about the transitional housing program." Harrison excused himself from the Globe reporter and followed his wife to the corner where they'd set up a media station. In the year since their story had exploded across headlines, the narrative had shifted dramatically. What had initially been portrayed as a scandal had become Boston's favorite love story, especially after the community center had helped over 200 people find permanent housing and employment. "Mrs. Sterling Monroe," the Channel 5 reporter began, "you've gone from being homeless to running one of the most successful social programs in Massachusetts. How does it feel?" Delilah's smile was radiant. "It feels like coming full circle. I spent years believing that losing my job meant losing my purpose. Now I realize it was just redirecting me toward where I was meant to be." "And the marriage. How do you two make it work when you come from such different backgrounds?" Harrison and Delilah exchanged the look of people who'd answered this question dozens of times but still found joy in the telling. "We don't come from different backgrounds," Harrison said. "We both come from families that taught us to help others. It just took us different paths to remember that lesson." "Plus," Delilah added with a grin, "he does the dishes and I handle the budget. Turns out being poor makes you really good at financial planning." The reporter laughed. "What's next for the Sterling Monroe family?" Harrison felt Delilah's hand squeeze his, and he knew she was thinking the same thing he was. The doctor's appointment last week. The news they'd been hoping for but hadn't dared believe. The future that stretched ahead of them, bright with possibility. "We're expanding," Delilah said carefully. "The program, I mean. We're opening a second center in Springfield next year, and we're launching a national nonprofit to replicate this model in other cities." It wasn't the whole truth, but the rest would wait for the right moment. Wait until they'd told Eleanor and Frank, who were across the room arguing with Betty about whether the refreshment table needed more cookies. Frank's cancer treatments had been successful beyond all expectations, and his doctors now talked about remission rather than survival time. Eleanor credited Delilah's presence in their lives with giving Frank the will to fight, though the oncologists preferred to discuss improved chemotherapy protocols. "One more question," the reporter said. "There were critics early on who said this was all a publicity stunt. What would you say to them now?" Harrison looked around the community center, at the dormitories where 24 people slept safely each night, at the computer lab where former addicts learned job skills, at the child care center where single mothers could leave their children while attending GED classes. In the corner, Betty's satellite diner served 3 meals a day to anyone who needed them, whether they could pay or not. "I'd say they were wrong," he answered simply. "This was never about publicity. It was about love. Love for each other, love for our community, and love for people who'd been forgotten by systems that were supposed to protect them." After the interview, Harrison and Delilah slipped away from the crowd to walk through the center's quiet corridors. In the lobby, Jerome Monroe's quote about kindness being the only worthwhile investment watched over visitors like a benediction. Beside it hung a photo of Betty at the original diner ribbon cutting, beaming as she accepted the key to the city for her extraordinary service to Boston's homeless community. "No regrets?" Delilah asked as they paused in front of the memorial wall, where photos honored people who died on the streets before finding help. "Only that it took me so long to find you," Harrison replied, pulling her close. "What about you? Miss the simplicity of having nothing?" Delilah laughed, the sound echoing in the marble lobby that had once been a loading dock where she'd slept on cardboard. "I never had nothing. I had dignity and hope, and the memory of a father who taught me to help others. Now I just have more resources to do it with." "Speaking of resources," Harrison said, his voice suddenly nervous. "About what we discussed with Dr. Patterson." "About the baby?" Delilah's eyes sparkled with mischief. What about it? Are you sure you're ready? The timing, with the new center opening, and the national expansion. Delilah silenced him with a kiss that tasted like joy and promises kept. Harrison Sterling Monroe, I've been ready for a family my whole life. The question is, are you ready to teach our child that kindness is the only investment worth making? Harrison rested his forehead against hers, thinking about the journey that had brought them here. A year ago, he'd been a billionaire who'd forgotten how to feel. She'd been a homeless woman who'd never stopped believing in goodness. Now they were partners in every sense of the word, building something beautiful from the wreckage of their separate struggles. I'm ready, he whispered. Outside, snow began to fall over Boston, but inside the Sterling Community Center, warmth radiated from every corner where love had conquered fear, where kindness had triumphed over indifference, and where two broken people had discovered that together, they could help heal a broken world. The fairy tale was real, but it wasn't about a billionaire rescuing a homeless woman. It was about two people rescuing each other. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this incredible journey. If this story touched your heart, wait until you see what's coming next. It's even more powerful and inspiring than you can imagine. So don't go anywhere. Click on that video showing on your screen right now to dive into another amazing story that will absolutely blow your mind. Trust me, you won't regret it.